morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. We are here to kind of listen to Cadet Wainwright's Institute Honor Thesis project. This was a quite interesting experience for the both of us because for me it's my first Institute Honors project that I have been mentoring, and I learned a lot in that progress. And I think for John it was similar, starting with trying and finding and formulating an interesting research question, especially the narrowing down of that question, figuring out how to approach it from a theoretical point of view, and then obviously the most challenging part was how do we test and analyze whatever we're going to try to argue. So I think he did a tremendous job in going through that process, and I hope he learned a lot from it. And I'm really pleased with the end results, although there can be still much more to be done. But I hope you enjoy his presentation on rhetorical changes during the Iraq War from the Bush administration, and we see what questions and comments you may have at the end of the presentation. And with that, I leave the floor to John.
Thank you very much, ma'am. General Smith, General Brower, faculty, cadets, thank you all for coming today. Before I start, I want to thank the IS department. Every one of the professors there mentored me and helped me get to this project, but I especially want to thank Professor Heuer. She consistently helped me out with guidance and knowledge, but also with her patience dealing with my erratic schedule and how busy I've been these last 2 semesters. So this project was a long time coming for me. I started in basically a totally different field of international studies, and I started with this fundamental question that why can't the U.S. win a war? You know, Vietnam, Iraq, we've consistently had problems winning decisive victories in battle. So I started looking all over the place for an answer, and what I found was people much smarter than me had already talked about a lot of things. So I looked at counterinsurgency doctrine, I looked at the civil-military divide, I looked at analogs to the French in Algeria and us in Vietnam, and I couldn't find anything. What I eventually found was this quote that kind of led me in a different direction with my research. So this is author John Nigel. He wrote, he's a premier author in the field of counterinsurgency, and he wrote, "Great powers do not lose small wars because they run out of tanks, soldiers, or money. If a great power like the United States loses a relatively small war like Vietnam, it does so because of the lack of public support at home." So this was like a distillation of the entire body of literature for me. What it meant was that, you know, I was looking in the wrong direction. I was looking at military strategy and all these things that didn't really apply. What I needed to take a look at was how is public support related to victory in battle. So I started down this long road of figuring out the body of literature surrounding public opinion. And it all starts with this sort of stifling opinion that existed from the 1940s to the 1970s by Almond and Lippmann. So this Almond and Lippmann consensus was that public opinion, one, is volatile and thus provides inadequate foundations for stable and effective foreign policy. It lacks coherence and structure, and in final analysis has little impact on foreign policy. So this opinion sort of kept us from advancing and looking particularly at public opinion. And when you think about it, it was really a result of the times, right? So the media and the way that the public can affect policy were less developed from the 40s to the 70s. And then once we hit the 70s and the Vietnam War, we see this total different line of research. And Holstein kind of distilled that when she talked about how the Johnson and Nixon administrations were affected deeply by the opinions of the public during the Iraq War, and that affected how they conducted the war. So that's sort of the jumping off point into this body of literature. Next, I look at Page and Shapiro, and these two were really leading lights in the field of this. So one of the first things they did was they coined this term, the rational public. A rational public is kind of the opposite of what Almond and Lippmann said. They said, when you look at public opinion as a whole, it's generally intelligent, and it generally has an ability to affect policy in different ways through people that are special interest groups that are particularly interested in one foreign policy opinion and this kind of thing. They also did a study that I'm going to test later through my study of rhetoric, which claimed that policy eventually lines up with public opinion. So they took a longitudinal approach, looked at all these domestic and foreign policies, and they said if a policy was not approved of by the public, eventually, through time and changes in administration, somehow the policy would get bumped to come more in line with what the public thought about it, right? So this was a general trend across administrations over this 20-year period. I think it was from 56 to 76, or this long longitudinal study they did that found that policy does in fact respond to changes in public opinion. So then I went and looked at Baum and Grollings. These are the modern guys. They do a lot of conflict study as it relates to public opinion, and they talk about something called the elasticity in public opinion. And they did so talking specifically about the Iraq War, which is convenient because that's my case study. So what they found is that the beginning of a new conflict, there's a wide range of public opinions that can exist. There's a whole bunch of different ways that the public can think about the war. And that public opinion is easily shaped by what elites like the president say about the war. But over time, over the course of a long conflict like the Iraq War, that elasticity gets replaced by real events of the conflict, right? So Abu Ghraib happens, and that kind of fixes what the public thinks about the war. Then Blackwater kills some civilians, and that fixes what people think about the war. So over time, there's this decline in the variability in public opinion and the ability of a leader to shape that public opinion. So then I had to go to Mrs. Colonel McDonald and talk to her about rhetoric. So she led me to look at Bitzer, and Bitzer is a leading light in the field of rhetoric. He talks about this conception of a rhetorical situation. A rhetorical situation is the combination of factors that prompt someone to give a speech, right? So for someone to need to try to affect reality by giving a speech, three things determine the situation. First is the exigence, or the purpose for giving a speech. Second is the audience that he's giving the speech to. In almost all these cases, it's the American people generally. And last is the constraining factors that limit what he can say reasonably about a topic, right? So each speech that I look at in my study has these three factors of rhetorical situation that I need to address, and I sort of try to understand how that shapes what the president talks about. He also has this definition of rhetoric, which I think is important and sort of foundational to what I thought about. So rhetoric is a mode of altering reality, not through direct application of energy to objects, but by the creation of discourse, which changes reality through mediation of thought and action. All right, so this sort of provides the mechanism through which a politician gives a speech and tries to influence public opinion, right? They're not thinking that by doing so they can change the world in a tangible way. They're just trying to change people's opinions and affect how they perceive one of their policies. So this is sort of the bread and butter of my theory. I took what I just talked about and a couple other leading lights in the field, and I put together this conception of how these three entities, the conflict, the executive, and the public, interact with each other. So to make this a little bit clearer, I wanted to put it in a specific example. So I'm going to talk about the surge strategy and try to explain how this dynamic sort of works. So in 2006, the conflict was in its darkest days, right? The war was fraught with sectarian violence. There was distrust at home. People didn't think we should stay in the war anymore. And the events of that conflict affected both the executive and the public. It put pressure on them to try to change and come up with a new strategy. So the difference between the executive and the public in this definition is that the executive has some ability to shape the events of the conflict through his policy, right? So Bush comes out with this surge strategy. We're going to do something new, counterinsurgency in Iraq. It's going to be great. And in doing so, he aims to shape the conflict to make it better and less and inflict less costs on the public and the executive. his policy doesn't just affect the conflict. Through the cost of his policy, particularly when we talk about the surge, we're talking about increased troop and the increased budget for the military. He inflicts costs on the public as well. If the public disagrees with his policy, they have the ability through audience costs. Audience costs are the ability of the public to hold an executive accountable. They have the ability to inflict pain back on the executive. So they did this in 2006, a little bit before the surge strategy was announced, in the 2006 midterm election. So in that election, the public became distrustful of Bush and Republican policy, and in a sweeping election, Bush lost most of the governorships in the country, the majority in the Senate, and the majority in the Congress. So audience costs are definitely a real thing, and the executive should always be concerned about how they're going to impact him, because they can severely limit his political power. So the part of my theory that's different is these informal connections in the middle, right? These two things are ways that amount to less than audience costs or policy costs that the executive and the public use to try to influence each other. So how can the public, without actually voting, change what the executive thinks about something? And it's obviously through public opinion, just as bombing, Growling, and Page Shapiro talked about. The executive is constantly concerned that he'll be punished in the ballot box, or he'll be punished and lose his political power. The executive, rather than changing policy, if he doesn't want to change his policy, he can try to influence the public through rhetoric. And he does so with rhetoric that tries to shape the events of the conflict in a more favorable light. All right, so this is sort of the foundation of my research. I'll come back to it at the end. So my specific research question: how are speeches and public addresses by the executive responsive to the constraints of public opinion? And in what ways does the executive develop narratives in an effort to communicate his policies to the public? The important thing that I had to work out here from a scientific standpoint is I can't prove that executive speech affects public opinion, right? There's too many factors that shape public opinion for me to say definitively Bush gave a speech, public opinion improved slightly, it was obviously because of Bush's speech. So I'm going at it from the other way. How does, the same way that Page and Shapiro talked about, that how does public opinion shape what the executive wants to talk about? And how is his speech affected by what the public thinks? So I sort of simplified this into 3 testable hypotheses. This is my text right out of the paper. It's complicated, so I'm not going to go into it. The basic way to explain this is reactive speeches will exhibit a different rhetorical style than routine speeches, right? So speeches are events-driven. Bitzer talked about that. So if the president is giving a speech, the speech that he's giving in response to a particular event, say a terrible thing that happened in the war, would be remarkably different than the speech that he'd give, just say, at a routine meeting at a VFW or a routine State of the Union address, because the exigence or the purpose for the speech is different. So I test to see if, when looking at the speech itself, can we demonstrate that there's a difference in how the president talks. The second one, over time, subject matter and types of claims will stagnate. So that goes back to the elasticity of public opinion, right? In the beginning, we should reasonably expect to see a wide variety of topics and types of claims that the president is trying to use to influence the public. And over time, that diversity should decrease into a few chosen and specific ways to talk about things. Last, public opinion shapes rhetorical styles based on whether an event is perceived as positive or negative, right? So this just kind of gets to the core of, like, if the president is responding to a terrible event, like Abu Ghraib, how will he talk about it differently than if he's talking about a good event, like the U.S. troops seizing Baghdad? And I sort of wanted to get to the core of that to see if there was anything in his speech about positive versus negative events. So I had to figure out a way how to operationalize speech, which I'll get to in a minute, but first I want to do a second on case selection. I chose the Iraq War for a bunch of reasons. First, it's a huge, there's a huge amount of literature about that. It's sort of become the premier case about when talking about public opinion in the war. Just because it's recent, it's accessible, there's a large amount of unbiased polling. I use Gallup polls to assess public opinion throughout the time, and those are widely considered fair and unbalanced. So the Iraq War also offers, right, this sort of complex narrative about why we got into the war and why, and the different narratives that Bush used throughout the course of the conflict to try to sell the war to the American people. So that left me with a lot to talk about in terms of what specific subjects Bush talks about in his speeches. All right, so now I had to operationalize everything. I started, as Rhetoric is events driven, I started with a list of events. So I compared 3 different timelines of the war from CFR, New York Times, and BBC. And I checked to find which events were the significant events, which events appeared in all 3 timelines. From there, I made a list of 10 events. After that, I tried to find a routine speech and a reactive speech for each one. So most of these they were so significant, the president came out right afterwards and gave a speech in direct response to what had just happened. So the after speeches were mostly easy. There was one exception there, which was the end of the Battle of Fallujah. I could not find a speech that directly addressed the Battle of Fallujah in the time period that I wanted to find one. So that's 1 month before or 1 month after. I'm not sure what the reason for that was. I thought it was kind of curious. One thing to talk about is that the presidential election, November 2004, was sort of right as the battle was going on. As another thing, it was a long battle. There was not a specific end date. I found a couple of different times that they said, all right, the battle's over now, or no, it's over now. So I'm not really sure why I couldn't find a speech there. So that left me with 18 speeches, right? I found my prior speeches within 1 month before, and I went from there. So now I had 18 speeches, about over 60 pages of text that I had to analyze to try to figure out what the president was talking about. Before I could do that, though, I had to figure out how I was going to analyze this. So I was dead set on doing like as close to a quantitative study of rhetoric as I could. So I had to find a way to sort of code and categorize rhetoric in a way that hadn't been done before. I started by sort of conceiving, based on some of my reading of other rhetoricians, that there's 3 parts to any statement. First is the topic, or what the president is talking about. Next is the type of appeal, or the type of argument he uses to try to convince someone that he's right. And third is the level of hyperbole that he attaches to that statement. So for topic, I found 18 topics that I sort of made before I ever looked at a speech. I made this list of 18 topics and said, these are the things I expect to see in his speeches, and I'll show you that list in a minute. For type of appeal, so there's 3 types here. The president may make a rationalizing argument, first of all. That's a logical appeal. He's trying to say, he's talking about the enemy, for example, and he's trying to say, we must defeat them because if we don't, they will threaten America this way, right? It's a logical, connected argument. Next is a normative appeal. So that may be a statement where he's saying the enemy is so strong and so aggressive that they threaten the United States. That's a normative. It's about how great the enemy is. Last is the emotional appeal. So this is the sort of Mankian rhetoric that we expect from the Iraq situation, right? That Bush said, the enemy is evil and we absolutely must defeat them because they threaten our values and they threaten evil on the world. So from there, I started going through speeches. And this is just an example. I wanted to demonstrate you first how small one of my units of measurement was. So this I considered one statement. This is from the presidential statement after they captured Saddam. For Ba'athist holdouts largely responsible for the current violence, there will be no return to corrupt power. and privilege they once held. So I took that statement, figured out what's the topic, all right? So the topic is obviously Ba'athist holdouts or the enemies in my topic list. Then I tried to figure out what type of appeal it was. So he's talking about there will be no return to corrupt violence. He's talking about power and privilege, so that's a normative statement to me. And then hyperbole, the way that's written, how aggressively it is, right? So for my hyperbole 3-point scale, a 1 is like a mundane statement you find in the middle of the speech. A 3 is like a real soundbite that he throws in. He expects the media to pick it up. It's really aggressive and sort of robust statement about what he's talking about. So for me, that's a 3. That's a real aggressive. No corrupt return to power and privilege they once held. He's really trying to like stick that statement. So obviously we can get into sort of subjectivity and objectivity of this method of analysis, but for my time, the time I had and the level of research I was doing, this is how I collected data. So this is my list of subtopics I wanted to get into. So I divided it into 3 major categories: participants, factors of the conflict, and themes of the conflict. Participants is all the people we may talk about related to the war. So there's the U.S., our allies, the American public, the Congress, or our enemies. For factors of conflict, those are all the things that would happen during the events of the war that he'd be forced to talk about. And finally, themes of the conflict were the major things like the reasons he sold for getting into the war, the things he might talk about in regards to why we need to be in the war, those sort of big themes there. I'll get into it at the end, but I felt like this list was pretty inclusive, and it kind of bore out that almost all the statements I ran into, I could chronicle as one of these. All right, so at Professor Heuer's direction, I made a full code book before I started anything. So I had to, it's pretty simple, you can see it here. So this is one piece, this is just for my first topic on enemies. So there were 18 more of these. And this was, so the subtopic here is enemies. This is what I'd expect a rationalizing, normative, or emotional claim to look like. And 1, 2, 3 is the level of hyperbole. All right, so I collected 1,914 data points over the course of my Christmas break. That was over the 18 speeches. It took me about an hour a day, every day over Christmas. And this is all the data I have to show for it. So let's go back and look at each of my hypotheses in turn. So hypothesis 1, reactive speeches will exhibit a different rhetorical style than routine speeches. So every other speech was reactive or routine. So every odd number is a routine speech given prior to an event. There's some event that happens in between the two, and then there's a reactive speech. So as you can see from this sort of up and down troughs and peaks dynamic in the data, there's definitely a different way in, say, this routine speech, he's using far more emotional claims than he is normative claims. In this reactive speech, he's using far more normative claims than he is emotional claims. I apologize, I forgot to set up this graph. So this is the percentage of each speech that's devoted to each type of claim, right? So this is about, this first speech is about 33% normative claims, it's about 44% emotional claims, and it goes on like that. So as we can see from the peaks and troughs though, that there's this up and down dynamic where every reactive speech is basically more normative than it is emotional, and every routine speech is much more emotional than it is normative. So that kind of demonstrates, right, there's something going on here, there's something interesting about how the president conceives when he sits down to write a routine speech at the VFW compared to a reactive speech to the fact that our troops just took Baghdad. This blue line is the rationalizing claims. So there's a great deal of every speech that's devoted to rationalizing claims, and that just has to do with setting up the situation, right, and sort of establishing what happened and what's going to continue to happen. So this isn't kind of correlated in the same way that we see with the relationship between emotional and normative claims. So I thought that was pretty interesting. The dynamic of reactive speeches being more normative is sort of reversed in the middle in this blue box temporarily. So if you look at these dates, this is the Iraqi election up to the resignation of Donald Rumsfeld. There's sort of this weird dynamic in the middle where it gets reversed, and then the excuse me, routine speeches are more normative, and the reactive speeches are more emotional, and that's just temporary, and then it goes back to the same dynamic it was. So hypothesis number 2: over time, in terms of subject matter and types of claims, will stagnate. This is my big graph, right? It's sort of the same thing as the last one. This is each one of these